You're listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm Aaron Goodman. I'm a journalist, documentary maker, and researcher, and I'm someone who's lived with multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS. MCS affects millions around the world. It's a condition that makes everyday life extremely challenging. Fragrance, air fresheners, fresh paint, scented laundry products on someone's clothing, and a lot more can trigger exhaustion, brain fog, muscle pain, rashes, and a wide range of symptoms. And yet, for all its impacts, MCS remains largely invisible. Most doctors dismiss it, employers rarely accommodate it, even friends and family struggle to understand. This podcast aims to change that. We dive into the latest research, share real stories, and explore how people navigate life with an illness many refuse to see. Now, lately on the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast, I've been checking in with you, the listener, about how we could possibly take to task researchers and clinicians who falsely, in my view, label MCS as a psychological disorder. In speaking with guests on the podcast, I've gained some helpful insights into why this continues to happen. And I know how deeply painful this form of healthcare invalidation can be for people with MCS and other illnesses. Some researchers defend industries that cause harm. Other scholars are blinded by their own training and disciplines. And many researchers still sadly don't speak with people with MCS and involve us in their studies. Why do we need research that challenges false claims when we know what's true? Credible research can influence how doctors respond to us and how and if they diagnose us. Research influences whether or not we're successful in requesting accommodations that we depend on, and it impacts how others, even loved ones, regard us. So when I came across Professor Beatrice Golomb's research about Gulf War illness and its ties to MCS, I quickly reached out to request an interview for the podcast, and I'll tell you why. Professor Golomb is a professor in residence of medicine at the University of California, San Diego in the United States. Her research focuses on the health effects of environmental and chemical exposures, mitochondrial and bioenergetic dysfunction, adverse effects of medications such as statins and others, and multi-symptom illnesses, including Gulf War illness and MCS. This is the second time Professor Golomb has been on the podcast, and I found our new conversation to be complex, yet the material and information she shared is understandable and deeply relevant and timely. Over decades, Professor Golomb has worked closely with soldiers who served in the Gulf War in Iraq in 1990 to 91. These veterans were deployed mainly to the Persian Gulf region, to Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. Gulf War illness is linked to exposures that occurred during that period to nerve agent prophylactics like pyridostigmine bromide, or PB, pesticides, oil well fire smoke, and other toxicants, rather than combat injuries. And many Gulf War veterans developed and continue to live with MCS. Through her decades of work, Dr. Golomb has uncovered that Gulf War illness is caused by cellular damage brought on by medication soldiers took and the chemicals they were exposed to. Specifically, and this is helpful for civilians with MCS, she says MCS is a result of the damage to part of our cells in our bodies, again, that are called mitochondria. Mitochondria are the power plants of our cells. They take the food we eat and the oxygen we breathe and turn them into energy so our cells and we can stay alive and active. Mitochondrial damage, or mitochondrial disease, as Professor Golomb says, created by toxins, medication, and compounded by a genetic inability to process chemicals, can lead to MCS. My hope is that her research spreads and that more and more scholars understand her work. And so when we go to doctors and clinicians, they can be on the lookout for mitochondrial damage, which can contribute to MCS. And I hope that soon we will no longer be told that MCS is in our head. So in this episode, you'll hear Professor Golomb go into detail about the connections between Gulf War illness and MCS, how through years of rigorous research and advocacy, she led a campaign that secured official medical recognition for Gulf War illness, transforming decades of dismissal into validation and care for affected veterans, how MCS is clearly not a psychological condition, but an illness, again, affected by mitochondrial or cellular damage, genetics, and chemical exposure. Hello again, Professor Golomb. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Would you please just take a moment to remind listeners about the importance of your research? Why have you spent so much time looking at the impact of chemical exposures for Gulf War veterans?
After close to 700,000 U.S. deployed veterans returned from the Gulf in 1991, a good fraction of them were reporting development of chronic multiple symptoms, and a lot of people were saying it's not real, it's in your head. And veterans that we spoke to this day say that their biggest psychological scars are not from the things they experienced in the war, but from the way they were dishonored by many medical providers on their return. And the early reports that came out from the Presidential Advisory Committee and the Institute of Medicine, which is now called the National Academy of Medicine, basically used the following inappropriate reasoning standard for organic causes, meaning physiological causes like environmental factors. They said absence of proof that it's responsible is proof of absence, whereas for stress, they basically said, well, gee, stress can cause lots of things, so it must be causing this. So basically for stress, suggestion was construed as proof. Like there was no requirement that the people that had more stress were more ill. There was no requirement that stress had led to a similar profile of chronic symptoms in previous settings. And indeed, subsequent data found that stress is not an independent predictor of Gulf War illness. So I was disturbed that these veterans who served their nation honorably and put their lives on the line for the country came back with toxic wounds from the war, and this was not taken seriously. Our work was the first to show that the energy powerhouses called mitochondria are affected in Gulf War illness, that the severity of Gulf War illness is tied to the severity of that energy deficit, that although inflammation is elevated in affected Gulf War veterans on average, not in everybody, the degree of elevation is not positively tied to illness severity. In fact, it's actually negatively tied to illness severity once you take into account the mitochondrial impairment. And it is tied to drivers of what's called programmed cell death or apoptosis, and many other findings of that kind, including findings like that treatment with CoQ10 in a double-blind randomized trial that is directed towards cell energy and oxidative stress both alleviated symptoms compared to placebo and then also significantly improved objectively measured physical function. We're doing a larger replication study of that right now, but those are some of the things that we found.
So what kind of medication were people exposed to that led to MCS?
I haven't specifically looked at the medications that led to MCS, but we know about the medicines that contributed to Gulf War illness severity. And about half of affected veterans in most of our studies, between 40 and 60%, depending on the study, of veterans with Gulf War illness are chemically sensitive. So they were given a nerve agent pretreatment pill, pyridostigmine bromide. A number of them were given ciprofloxacin, a fluoroquinolone agent that our data and others' data have tied to chemical and actually even electromagnetic sensitivity, and is also tied in existing literature to, quote, photosensitivity with ultraviolet light and, quote, radiosensitivity, meaning medical radiation. So that's ionizing radiation. And fluoroquinolones are also mitochondrial toxins, and they were given in some cases for biowarfare protection in the event that Saddam Hussein used his stockpile of weaponized anthrax, which should not happen. Those are the main sort of drugs for which there's data tying them to Gulf War illness severity. Certainly, there are other drugs like mefloquine, which is an antimalarial that is tied to mitochondrial injury, and persistent problems in some people, often neuropsychiatric problems, but those were the main sort of
Mhm.
drugs that were given. And also, there were vaccinations, including the anthrax vaccine, the first widespread use during a time when there was very lax FDA oversight of the production. And it was the exclusive time that botulinum toxoid vaccine was used in the military, and a high number of multiple vaccines were the other medications that were involved, and in some studies have been tied to presence and severity of illness.
Very interesting. So I know many listeners are very interested in finding supplements that can assist people with MCS. You
Mhm.
mentioned CoQ10. Do you want to talk about what role CoQ10 may play in assisting with mitochondrial damage
Yep.
and MCS?
Yep. So I don't really know how effective it is for MCS, but I can tell you what our findings are related to mitochondrial impairment and oxidative stress and MCS and how that would relate to CoQ10. And also, I can mention other supplements that are broadly beneficial for mitochondrial antioxidation and have shown benefit against injury from innumerable chemicals, as has CoQ10. So let me sort of start by saying what I think is going on as a piece of the
Mhm.
puzzle with chemical sensitivity. And the fact that both in our Gulf War population, and now we're also studying the people that were exposed to the train derailment and chemical release and burn in East Palestine, Ohio in February 2023. And we find that their illness profile, the ones that develop persistent symptoms, is a match to Gulf War illness. And also in that group, around half of those that meet those Gulf War illness criteria also report new chemical sensitivity. So that's a match there as well with a completely different group of chemicals. Among the things that led me to focus on mitochondrial impairment in Gulf War illness are the following. So pretty much every chemical, no matter its chemical class or nominal mechanism of action, produces part of its toxicity by damaging mitochondria and causing oxidative stress. And I've heard doctors say multiple chemical sensitivity can't be real because people are responding to chemicals from completely different chemical classes with different mechanisms. But the thing is, mitochondrial injury occurs for pretty much every chemical, no matter what its mechanism. And also, there's what are called gene environment interaction data, so that people that have a genetic variant of a enzyme that detoxifies one of those exposures where their detoxification is impaired. If they
Mhm.
also had the exposure, their illness rates are much higher. For
Mhm.
example, there was a 2015 study that these variants of enzyme called butyrylcholinesterase involved in detoxifying TB should be looked at because if there was a causal relationship, people that had genetically impaired detoxification should have higher rates of
Mhm.
illness if they took the
Mhm.
PB. And the evidence now shows that. So
Mhm.
people who took the PB, if they have the usual variant of the detoxifying enzyme, they had about a 2.6-fold elevated risk of developing Gulf War illness. If they had the impaired detoxifying gene but didn't take PB, they have no elevated risk, which is
Mhm.
ideal. It means they weren't predestined to be ill by their
Mhm.
genetics, acquired the exposure.
Mhm.
But if they had the PB and the impaired detoxification, it's a 40-fold elevated risk of illness, which is
Mhm.
obviously quite substantial.
Mhm.
So back to the why mitochondria. So first off, like
Mhm.
every chemical pretty much contributes to that. And
Mhm.
different Gulf War veterans had very different chemical exposures. There was everything on the battlefield from depleted uranium to smoke from oil fires to jet fuel to something called chemical agent resistant compound or KIRK paint, permethrin impregnated uniforms, massive numbers of different exposures with different veterans experiencing different subsets of those. And yet the profile of illness from veteran group to veteran group remained consistent. And so that suggests to me that, again, this shared mechanism that can add and synergize across different chemicals was dominating the illness profile. Second feature was what are the nature of the symptoms that are elevated, and pretty much Gulf War veterans have multiple symptoms spanning many different symptom classes, which is
Mhm.
classic for mitochondrial impairment, but dominated by fatigue, brain, and muscle symptoms that is to say fatigue, which is itself sort of low energy, and then symptoms, what are called post-mitotic organs, meaning they're mostly done dividing, that have high energy demand, brain and muscle. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's also classic for mitochondrial impairment. And then also there was variable latency to symptom onset. There was a study that showed that like of these increased symptoms that these Gulf War veterans had, 40% of them emerged over a year after people had come back. That's
Mm-hmm.
also classic for mitochondrial impairment. The variable latency to onset is classic, and that's because the mitochondrial impairment begets more oxidative stress. So mitochondria are the main source of the free radicals, the oxygen free radicals that cause oxidative stress. And their its main target because most of those free radicals are made right there in the mitochondria. So mitochondrial DNA and RNA and lipids and proteins are especially vulnerable. And then mitochondrial DNA also have less efficient repair mechanisms than the regular Watson-Crick double-strand DNA that you inherit from both parents. Mitochondria are kind of like little colonies of bacteria in every cell. And in fact, the main theory of what mitochondria are is that is how they originated. They have their own bacterial style DNA that is generally inherited only from the mother, but their DNA repair mechanisms are less robust, which is
Mm-hmm.
why as people get older, especially, well into older age, there's sort of exponential rise in mitochondrial DNA mutations because once they hit a certain point, they cause more free radicals to be produced in the
Mm-hmm.
process of energy generation, and that leads to more mitochondrial DNA damage and worse mitochondrial function, which leads to still more free radicals and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
so in Gulf War illness, it looks like that's just happening at an earlier age. And in fact, many or most of the features of Gulf War illness look like accelerated aging. The conditions that they have at high rates are conditions that typically rise with age, and then the symptoms are symptoms that typically rise with age, et cetera. So those were some of the reasons why it looked like it had to be mitochondrial impairment, and indeed findings were that it is mitochondrial impairment. Again, there are other objective markers that are altered, most of which can be explained by mitochondrial impairment and its downstream mechanisms. And then back to CoQ10, you asked how does that help?
Yes.
Well, CoQ10, it's actually a coenzyme in mitochondrial electron transport made by the body. Both production and transport are inhibited by things like statin cholesterol lowering drugs, which block a step early in the pathway. And cholesterol also transports coenzyme Q10, which is the reason why some people on statins get fatigue and muscle problems and cognitive problems, the same kinds of problems that Gulf War veterans get. But it's usually reversible because when you stop the statin, the coenzyme Q10 level, which was the problem, goes back up, which is different from the mechanism of mitochondrial impairment in Gulf War veterans. So it is a cofactor. There are data showing that essentially, irrespective of the respiratory chain defect, meaning which particular problem in the mitochondrial quote electron transport or energy production chain, coenzyme Q10 helps to bypass that defect, which is also why you take something like statins, which is basically withdrawing CoQ10, and you're quote unmasking unquote mitochondrial problems. So all of us start out with mutations and deficits and so forth, but the hope is that they're covered by adequate levels of antioxidants and energy supports and that there's adequate energy reserve. And in fact, that's what I think is the issue with chemical sensitivity. You have
Mm-hmm.
somebody that's been exposed to chemicals, their energy reserve has been cut, and their antioxidant defenses are strained by existing oxidative stress from mitochondrial damage itself and or from other chemicals and exposures. And so they're either perched close to the point where there's not enough energy to prevent symptoms, or they're already on the steep part of the curve where each additional cut in energy or increase in oxidative stress produces more symptoms. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's why in Gulf War veterans, it's generally the ones that develop Gulf War illness. They're far more likely to be the ones that have chemical sensitivity because they're the ones that are already on the steep part of the curve where cell energy isn't enough to protect against symptoms in the general state and or antioxidant defenses are not sufficient to offset
Mm-hmm.
oxidative stress, and that leads to symptoms.
This is fascinating, complex, but fascinating. It really resonates. Are there any practical steps that people might do to reduce oxidative stress and or support mitochondrial health?
Yeah, there are a number of them, and probably three supplements that have the strongest evidence of really broad benefit. And again, there are studies for each of them showing protection, amelioration, defense, mitigation of harm from myriad different chemicals, radiation, etc. Are coenzyme Q10 itself,
Mm-hmm.
and then melatonin, which people
Mm-hmm.
think of as for sleep, but actually it's a really critical free radical scavenger that also upregulates other antioxidants, and N-acetylcysteine, which is the precursor for glutathione, which is another of the major important antioxidant
Mm-hmm.
pathways. Glutathione peroxidase needs selenium, and so some people will also recommend adding some selenium together with your other supplements in order to have
Mm-hmm.
that cofactor be present. But those
With
are the things.
glutathione, correct? The last one
Yeah,
was glutathione.
glutathione is produced from N-acetylcysteine. You can get things like liposomal glutathione that may be assimilated. The reason a lot of people use the precursor NAC is that glutathione is usually not that well assimilated by the body. That several amino acids that make up glutathione, or pretty much N-acetylcysteine, is the most commonly used thing. I should mention that for N-acetylcysteine, there will be people that get worse. There are issues like people may have gene variants in like something, for example, called glutathione reductase, where they may have trouble making glutathione go back to the reduced form that serves as an antioxidant. So for NAC, I don't know if it's equal true for melatonin. I haven't really looked that up. But for a lot of antioxidants, there will be a subset of people that rather than being made better, will be made worse. In the case of coenzyme Q10, it comes in both the ubiquinone form, which has been on the market far longer and has a much more robust body of evidence showing that it protects against many, many different things, from headache to heart attack to cutting the risk of death in heart failure patients by over 40% compared to placebo, protects against fatigue and pain and lots of different things. Most of those data are with the ubiquinone form. And we did our first study with the ubiquinone form, even though there were a lot of people saying, oh, ubiquinol is better because it's the reduced form that can serve as an antioxidant. And my thinking was that's a nice theoretical claim, but there aren't the clinical data, and sometimes there will be a surprise, like either this thing you put in the pill to keep it in the reduced form is causing a problem, or this or that. And indeed, we later found that both for Gulf War veterans and for fluoroquinolone affected patients, a subset, a minority subset, but a subset report getting better on ubiquinone, but actually being made worse on ubiquinol. So energy production uses the ubiquinone form, the oxidized form. And if the CoQ10 inside the mitochondria is too heavily in the quote reduced form, the form that serves as an antioxidant, it will actually drive energy production backward, will harm energy production, and paradoxically increase the oxidative stress inside the mitochondrion. So we tend to, not, this is not a recommendation, but for
Mm-hmm.
people who want to take CoQ10, because my personal attitude is first do no harm, and some people are made worse with ubiquinol, even though maybe some people will be made better with it. We tend to go with the ubiquinone form. And I should also mention that there are very wide differences in bioavailability for different products, and CoQ10 is hard to make bioavailable. We used a specific brand, actually the Pharmanord brand made in Denmark, for our studies, and that's been used in a lot of the studies that have shown the different benefits. And I mention that because it's not really the case that all ubiquinone is created equal, and some of the most affected mitochondrial patients I know get tremendous benefit from that brand. And I think there are probably a couple of other good brands, but there are a lot that really just are not bioavailable and don't really
Mm-hmm.
do much of anything for some people.
And that brand, did you meant to say Pharmanoid?
Pharmanord,
Pharmanoid.
Pharma, capital Nord. And I don't mean to be,
No, no.
touting a particular brand, but for this supplement, it's
Yes.
the quality control and bioavailability issue is so important.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Professor, I want to ask you about the connection between Gulf War illness and MCS for the general population, people who
Uh,
haven't served in the military. And so much of what you've shared resonates with me personally, and I think it will resonate with others. For example, in my youth, I had methylquin, anti-malarial, when I
Oh,
worked
interesting.
overseas. Yeah. I also was exposed to cypermethrin. You mentioned permethrin was in the clothing of people in the
Yep,
military.
yep.
Multiple vaccines for working in the global south. Do you want to talk a little bit about, do you think your findings apply to civilians with MCS?
I do think they apply to civilians with MCS, with the caveat that, for example, the genetic finding that we may or may not get to talking about,
Mm,
its relation to MCS is mostly going to show up in samples of people that have been heavily chemically exposed. Because if you don't have a lot of mitochondrial oxidative stress to manage, then genetic management of mitochondrial oxidative stress is not going to show up as a factor. So unless you've got a population with a lot of people that are chemically sensitive, ideally with people who are and are not chemically sensitive, both having had chemical exposures, then you can't really see how the genetics plays
mhm.
out in determining
Yeah.
chemical sensitivity risk. The point of showing the genetic relationship is several fold. Right now, when doctors put in a diagnostic code for chemical sensitivity, it's usually under the somatoform or somatic symptom disorder label, which basically means it's all in patients' heads. And that is a tremendous disservice to affected people, and it drives the belief that the problem isn't real and it's not really caused by chemicals. And the thing is, it doesn't matter whether you have this particular genetic variant or not that promotes it. What this shows is that there is a pathway that involves mitochondrial oxidative stress management that is implicated. But there may well be other genes that influence that pathway that people have. And the particular genetic finding that we have doesn't call for a different management approach than just the knowledge that mitochondrial management of oxidative stress is implicated. I will say that there is a follow-up genetic thing that we really need to look at. And if you have people on your podcast that want to help by participating in a genetic study, have them reach out to us.
The research that you're doing is very important, and we'll share a contact in the show notes for people who want to reach out. And I want to ask you, Professor Golomb, this year, I believe, Gulf War illness finally received its own medical
Diagnostic code.
diagnostic code,
Yes, I
correct?
led
That
that effort.
you were a big part of that effort. And
I led it. Yes.
yeah, and it's so important. But do you want to talk about why it's important, not only for folks with Gulf War illness, but potentially for people with MCS? Because as you mentioned, when we go to a doctor, there isn't a diagnostic code, and that's why we're told it's a psychological disorder. So, what does this change perhaps for civilians?
I hope it leads the way for a broader understanding that just because a doctor doesn't happen to understand somebody's problems, just because they have multiple symptoms, just because one of their routinely conducted tests doesn't show an abnormality with a given group of people, doesn't mean the problem isn't real. And again, we've seen the same thing, whether it's fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, Gulf War illness. We see that there are a group of people who say the problem isn't real, it's all in their head, they're just malingering, and yet they continue to say this even after there's abundant evidence showing problems. And in each of those cases, mitochondrial problems and other cell energy impairment problems are part of it. There's mitochondrial problems in also long COVID, mitochondrial problems documented in fibromyalgia, and also
Mm,
there are studies showing that, and these are not uncorrelated, by the way, showing that patients with fibromyalgia have reduced, quote, capillarity in their muscle, meaning they have fewer blood vessels, meaning that some of those cells don't have easy access to
mm,
the oxygen and the glucose and the other energy substrates. There's ischemic muscle pain, meaning not enough energy to the cells, that arises very easily when there's not enough blood flow. And on top of that, you have impaired mitochondrial function. In chronic fatigue syndrome, there's analogous data showing that a good chunk of people have reduced total body blood volume. And so when you go to the doctor, they measure like your hemoglobin and your hematocrit, which is the red blood cells and oxygen carrying capacity per blood volume. But if the total blood volume is low, then that doesn't show up. That hematocrit and oxygen carrying capacity may look normal, but that's again per volume. And if you're down like a liter of blood out of 5 or 6 liters, then that oxygen carrying capacity is actually inadequate and will contribute to driving things like fatigue. I think it's not an accident that mitochondrial impairment shows up in these problems because doctors are basically trained in quote organ based physiology. Like it's either a lung problem or a heart problem or a kidney problem or a liver problem. And mitochondrial problems don't fit an organ based system. Cell energy is needed for every cell in the body. More energy is needed for highly energy demanding organs like brain and muscle and heart, but all organs need energy. And so mitochondrial impairment can cause symptoms in all organs. And those
Mhm.
symptoms vary a bit from person to person. And there are a
Mhm.
lot of reasons for that. There's something called, quote, heteroplasmy, which means that those colonies of bacterial mitochondria have different mutations. And those mutations may go to some organs so that people can start out with different vulnerability in different organs. And then on top of that,
Mhm.
we talked about medications and other exposures. Those can have a tropism, meaning can preferentially go to some organ like the liver or the kidney or the skin, making that part of the body then become more vulnerable in that person. So that so different people in mitochondrial disease in general and in environmentally triggered mitochondrial disease in specific, the patterns of illness on a group level are consistent, but individual to individual, different people will have different ones of the symptoms that are characteristic. And
Mhm.
again, doctors aren't used to thinking in that way. And there is a legacy that comes from Freud back in the era where neurology and psychiatry hadn't yet divided up, where he had this basically delusional idea that a lot of different medical problems were in patients' heads. And it's basically the
Mhm.
same kind of thinking that has come down through history. There never was any positive evidence that psychogenic illness ever produces persistent symptoms in anybody. It was a made up idea that took hold and has had a persistent legacy to this day. When I entered medical residency, I remember seeing a list of the causes of low back pain, and top on the list was psychogenic. And
Mm.
then miraculously, when ergonomics came in, somebody figured out that people had transitioned heavily to office jobs and didn't understand ergonomics. And then people began understanding ergonomics, and miraculously, it fixed all those neuroses. So these ideas that when there's a problem where you don't have something you can measure, there seem to be a good chunk of people who choose to believe that the patient is responsible for their problem. And I think that's unconscionable. I think it's a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. Our data on Gulf War veterans suggests that those damaging attitudes not just cause emotional distress in the patient, but they also affect things like return for care and following provider directions, which makes sense because they erode trust in the provider. And then that can affect both continuity of care and also effective care for their other health problems. So these
Mm.
are very damaging attitudes. They were never justified and they need to be stamped out.
I'm so grateful to you for talking about that. At some point, the researchers and clinicians who continue to put out this false argument that multiple chemical sensitivity is a psychological disorder, you
Mhm.
think they owe us an apology?
Yeah, I do think so, but I don't know what that exactly brings you. But most of all, they need a revision in their attitude. In a lot of the settings where these problems emerge that are classed by some people as mass hysteria or psychogenic are settings where there's a party with a financial stake, chemical injury settings, drug adverse effect settings. Those are settings where there's a powerful, wealthy party that has an interest in denying that their product bears a role. And I think that may be a reason for the persistence of these concepts in medicine, because that seems to be the primary place where these continue to take hold. Very
You're
much.
talking about the military industrial complex, right? And the chemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry.
The
What's bigger
chemical
than
industry,
those?
the pharmaceutical industry, for people with electrosensitivity, there's the utility industry, there's big data, there's big telecom, all of those things.
Hmm. Professor Golomb, are you continuing to encourage younger researchers to follow this path?
It's not an easy path to follow in research because there's not really a separate body of funding. And so that is challenging. People typically go where the money is because that's how you have and maintain a career. And so that's a big challenge. We actually have some amazing additional preliminary data on chemical sensitivity related both to the mitochondrial things and related actually to membrane effects. I think are
Membrane effects. Membrane
yeah,
effects?
yeah. So like it turns out membranes are the barriers of the cell, but they also have critical roles in the energy process. And it looks like both of those are turning out to be really important. And we're struggling to figure out where can we go to get the resources to take the next step. And that's a big challenge, I will say. And that is, I think, a reason like a lot of the things I have, the areas that I've embarked on have been areas where not a lot of scientists tread because there hasn't really been a will to fund them.
Mm.
And that is an issue. And the good news is for a while, there was this pot of Gulf War illness funding that has been very fruitful in helping with
Mhm.
chemical sensitivity because chemical sensitivity was a big part of Gulf War illness, but I think we've paid more attention to than anybody else. We've got also a paper showing that patients with higher chemical sensitivity ratings also have higher rates of actual adverse effects to many drugs and chemicals. The more
Mhm.
kind of acknowledged adverse effect issues are also elevated. So it's hard for me to exactly encourage students to go somewhere where it's not really clear if they can have a sustained career. But I would encourage people to reach out to your Congress people, to NIH, et cetera, and encourage them to advance funding in this area. And if people happen to know philanthropists that have an interest in this kind of area, that is often a place where initial important work can happen as well.
How is it for you as a researcher taking on this work and not seeing other people doing it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I guess because I've always felt like I'm a patient advocate and I pick areas where it feels like the need is greatest, where there are a lot of people suffering and there are not a lot of doctors and scientists trying to help them. I'm on the outside trying to move the needle. But on the other hand, it's really worthwhile work. And when we get letters like the ones we've gotten recently from Gulf War veterans who are so appreciative about the ICD code, that's the kind of thing that really makes it all worthwhile.
Thank you so much for taking time. And I hope it's okay if I reach out again in the future as your research continues. And I will share the contact for your research. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your interest in the area.
You've been listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm the host and podcast creator, Aaron Goodman. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast is by and for the MCS community. The podcast is generously supported by the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation and listeners like you. If you wish to support the podcast, please visit chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Your support will help us continue making the podcast available and creating greater awareness about MCS. To learn more about the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast, follow the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Thanks for listening. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and its associated website are the work of Aaron Goodman, made possible with funds from the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation, supporting efforts to educate and inform physicians, scientists, and the public about multiple chemical sensitivity. The content, opinions, findings, statements, and recommendations expressed in this Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and associated website do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of its sponsors.